Welcome to Modular 3. As you can see, this time period is a very critical time period in many ways from the 1970s to 2001. Here we'll see that that resources, and in the former module you saw how dependent British Columbia was on resources, and we're going to see that there are things that lead to resource uncertainty. We'll see changes in technologies, we'll see changes in political activity that lead to that uncertainty. And I think one of the things that was part of the uncertainty, certainly that would be labeled by politicians at that time in this slide, is about First Nations. Again, we have a long history of First Nations striving to gain back their land. And I think many things came to a head with the 1969 white paper, as you can see up there, and you can see another Trudeau being involved in that at the time. And so Pierre Trudeau thought he would end up sort of, quote, solving the problem of First Nations across Canada. And so what he proposed in this white paper, and by the way, a white paper is not done very often by governments. What it means is a set of proposals, and they put it out front, and they say, what do you think about that? And here's what some of the things that people are asked to think about, First Nations are asked to think about, is that there would be, the treaty lands, and you can see that on the right over here on the map, all the treaties across Canada. And he said, let's forget all the treaties. And many of you think the Indian Act is an act of oppression. We're gonna cut out the Indian Act. And as for reserves, we're simply going to divide the reserves up amongst the various First Nations, so you all have private land. So this was his idea then, and how did they react? Right across Canada, there was a reaction of complete outrage, and some of the largest First Nation organizations in Canada, including here in British Columbia, were opposed to this. In part, what it meant is that not recognizing that right to land. How about for the people who never had treaties? What was going to be recognized then? And of course, if you look at the treaties, those numbered treaties across the prairie, for example, some of them ended up with reserves of 160 acres per family, the size of the reserve. Others were 640 acres. In British Columbia, we got reserves with no treaties of 10 acres. And so to just end the treaties, end the reserve system, and it doesn't come to the inequity that was there in the first place. And the Indian Act may have been lots of it oppressive, but it also gives First Nations rights. And so what was going to take place with that? The long and the short of it all is that Trudeau, to his credit, pulled the white paper. He didn't go through with it. He saw the reaction, the negative reaction to that. But at the same time, another case was going through the Supreme Court of Canada, and it's called the Calder case. And Frank Calder was the chief of the Nisga's in northern British Columbia. Anyway, the Calder case ended up at the Supreme Court of Canada with 7 judges. They were there to hear only 2 questions. And the first one is, did Aboriginal title exist historically? In other words, did they have the rights to the land historically? And 2, does it still exist? In other words, do they still have the rights? And the judges argued back and forth, and it turned out that 3 judges agreed that, well, first of all, I should say that all 7 judges said, yes, it did exist historically. But the second question, does it still exist? 3 judges said, no. That it was extinguished with Confederation. And 3 judges said, yes, it still exists. We never dealt with it. The 4th judge, unfortunately, I guess, because of a technicality, threw it out of the court. So it was a no decision. But yet, in many ways, we'll see it was the most important decision in Canada for First Nations, and that's because Pierre Trudeau was watching these deliberations, and he agreed with the judges that said yes, it still exists. And this is the beginning of modern day treaties, or called comprehensive claims. And so you can see how British Columbia, the Yukon, much of the Northwest Territories, northern Quebec, um, uh, are unceded lands. And so now they are open for modern day treaties. And the other term there, specific claims, of course, there were all kinds of trespass, all kinds of things that happened to even treaty lands, and to reserves that were done, and land that was taken away. So the specific claims are actually to deal with that. So it's a step in the right direction, although I must say right from the beginning is that, well, we start to get to the modern day treaties and the Yukon Northwest Territories, and of course that's how Nunavut was created. But the politicians in British Columbia said no, they were still in denial. They don't recognize modern day treaties. They felt that they were extinguished with Confederation. Now, we saw in the last module that W.A.C. Bennett and his party were voted out in '72. The NDP came in for a brief 3 years. And while they did a number of things in relationship to resource management and try to harvest resources more sustainable, that perhaps the most important thing, and I put this up here, is that they were the ones to come to terms with all of that urban sprawl on agricultural land, that some of the best agricultural land in the Fraser Valley and the Okanagan, over in Vancouver Island, throughout the Okanagan, Kootenays, and so forth, because we don't have a great deal of good agricultural land. Most of it's in river valleys, and so it's been gobbled up by other than agricultural uses as it gets turned into houses, industrial parks, and golf courses, and on and on and on. And so they were the ones that struck the Agricultural Land Commission and created the Agricultural Land Reserves. And again, if you're looking for projects, this is a good one to look to, and you'll see that all agricultural land can be done in classes from 1 to 7, and 1 is the best agricultural land you can have. 7 is no agricultural capability, and you can see where some of that is just in this picture. And so there are, of course, political divisions in terms of whether that should happen or shouldn't happen, but I can tell you that the land reserve still is in place to this day. And then in the parlance of politics, all hell broke loose. And by that I mean is that we then got into our first energy crisis, which is really an oil crisis. And people were not thinking much about oil. It seemed to be plentiful, and it was certainly cheap, and ran cars and planes and boats and everything else. And then all of a sudden, from 73 to 80, it escalated in price. And so here you can see on this graph that is going from essentially $5, and that spot price is up to $40 a barrel. So when we look at what energy sources did we use here in British Columbia, and we talked earlier about hydroelectricity and natural gas, but we also, of course, use petroleum, oil. In fact, about 50% of our consumption of energy in British Columbia was oil. And that was fairly typical across Canada. There are countries like Japan that were probably 90% dependent on imported oil because they have very few energy sources themselves. Here's the thing, is that we think about running our car, but you know, oil is in so many products, and here's just a summary of a few of the products you can see there, from polyesters to paints. But there's so many plastics, of course, and tires and all kinds of things that are dependent on oil. So if the price goes from $5 to $40, then the price of all of these goods that have that energy source in them must also rise. And so that's why I put down here about this massive inflation that occurred. So $1 worth of goods in 1970 was now worth $2.17 by 1980. So if your wages aren't going up by over 100% in that time, then of course you're going backwards. You can't afford that many things, and so this is the period of time of, as I say, wages chasing the cost of living. The price of mortgages was outrageous. This was clearly a crisis, and clearly pointing their finger at a resource that was the cause of that crisis. Well, many countries around the world reacted to that crisis, and in many ways. In British Columbia, BC Hydro, which of course is a crown corporation of the government, they came up with their own plan, and their plan was like, let's switch to hydroelectricity. Let's switch to electricity overall, even if it isn't hydroelectricity. And so their plan included damming a whole series of rivers, and turning the pulp mills and all the other users of oil, big users of oil and heating homes and all those things to electricity. And so they were going to dam even the Fraser River and the Skeena and the Iskut and the Stikine and the Yard and so on, and a number of rivers in the Kootenays. And so they felt even that wasn't going to be enough. And so they were going to have coal-fired generators. Again, back to Hat Creek near Cache Creek, near Kamloops, and another plant in the Kootenays, in the East Kootenays. And even then, they thought that might not be enough, and we need 2 nuclear power plants, one outside of Victoria and one outside of Vancouver, to provide all this electricity. And they're talking about an increase of like 10 to 12% as part of their projections. Now, people are fairly rational in British Columbia and hopefully elsewhere, and so they had their own ideas about what to do about the high prices of energy, and they reacted strongly. The forest industry, the #1 industry in the province at that time, and probably the largest user of petroleum at that time, said, don't count on us taking your electricity. We're going to create our own. And they did. And that's what hog fuel is all about. It's about using the waste from the pulp mill process, it's called black liquor, and you mix that with the chipping up the barks and slabs from the sawmills, and you've got a ready fuel to use in a hog fuel burner that produces electricity. They were becoming self-sufficient. And you know, individual house owners were doing similar things. They couldn't stand the price of an oil furnace and what it was costing them in the wintertime, and so they threw those out and installed airtight stoves that burn wood efficiently, and put more insulation in their houses and built solar homes, and this is that start of looking at conservation of energy as opposed to looking at the supply side of energy. And again, that's a very interesting project to get involved in terms of how we use energy. Although at that time 3 dams were built, 2 relatively small ones, 7 miles in the Kootenay, about 700 megawatts. Peace Canyon, just down from the big W.A.C. Bennett Dam, another 700 megawatts. But the Revelstoke Dam was built, and there's 2,700 megawatts of electricity. So some huge dams were built, but as we'll see in the short run, there really wasn't a need for this energy. The government was worried about this massive inflation. How do we curb it? And so through monetary measures here in Canada and the United States and around the world, they ultimately put in monetary measures that caused a major global recession, which lasted from 81 to 86. And that recession really meant that world market prices for so many things declined, especially commodities such as wood and even oil. The prices collapsed, and so mines and mills shut down. And you can see just some of the statistics here. From 1981 to 84, employment in British Columbia fell by 79,000, with losses of 3,100 in forestry, 10,400 in mining, 23,600 in construction. Nobody's building anything. 37,700 in manufacturing, and a lot of that manufacture was pulp mills and paper mills. And so it's really the goods producing sector that got hit hard by this major recession. And for some of you know Chemainus on Vancouver Island, it's labeled the little town that did, is just one example of the trauma and the collapse of a community dependent essentially on a single resource. Their very large sawmill, the McMillan-Bodell mill, had about 650 workers in 1982, and it closed. So remember that first module about that downward spiral? Well, you can imagine that a mill of 650 workers closing, they're not going to the coffee shops anymore. Many of them are leaving. So that downward spiral is going to be hard on people. They did, in 2 years' time, start up a new mill. The new mill only had 150 workers. And this new state-of-the-art mills that we have around British Columbia, that's like a laser light show if you ever go into one. They're all mechanized and fabulous. And while they do produce 2x4s, they can easily switch to making, soji boards for Japan market, and those are in metric, not in the feet and inches that most of those workers were used to. The term flexible specialization was starting to be used, and that's just another word really for being able to source wood and source other from any other places, and contracting out, meaning that we can just get workers from some other place for a short period of time. They don't have to be unionized, and that's what's happening. For Chemainus, they were caught in all of this. They're called the little town that did because what they did is probably the key change for so many communities across Canada is that they painted their town. They painted the murals of their history on the town. In other words, they shifted to the tourist industry, and the tourist industry really means they shifted to the service side of industries, and so the cafes and all the stores that sell things to tourists. But it was successful. Successful in the terms of they now have about 1 million tourists a year going through Chemainus, and all stopping and buying things, and people being employed. Unfortunately, the workers in Chemainus are probably not getting the unionized wages that the mill workers were when the old mill was working. So that's perhaps one of the downsides. The digital revolution. It really took that energy crisis and recession to trigger it all. It'd been in the works for, well, ever since after World War II, and we're talking about the computer. But accompanying the computer is all the things that makes the computer being used globally. And so we're talking about satellite communication, coaxial cables. But it's also about what I call technologies of time-space convergence, which is a very good geographic concept. And so here we're talking about the super tankers and air cargo carriers that can move goods relatively simply and easy and huge amounts in relatively short periods of time. This is the reaction to that crisis. It's really called globalization. And really what it is you see this the notation down there, fragmenting the production process. A simple question you ask is, how are things made? And then the next question you ask is that, where's the cheapest place in the world to have that come together? So if you're soldering, little gold wires on mainframes for a computer, then you say, well, that's a very labor-intensive job. Where's the cheapest place in the world that that can happen? And you say, oh, in the Philippines, or Kerala in India, or any number of cheap labor places, because the global division of labor means that while we're talking about the movement of goods and information and instance, that the one element that doesn't move too rapidly are workers. And so the global division of labor means that labor can't move very easily, and so you get cheap labor regions of the world. And so that's where many of the labor-intensive jobs go. And so if you look at an automobile today, or a television, or a computer, it's looking at many ways at a map of the world in terms of all the components of where they're made and where they're put together. And so this was the beginning of it. This digital revolution is the beginning of it. And it's going to affect our resource industry tremendously. I forgot to mention with that digital revolution, you see, when we talked about Staples theory, that's one of the things that Harold Innis back in the 1920s could never have anticipated. He thought resources were the way you got the economy going. And what this did is essentially say, you know what? Maybe resources aren't as important as you think they are. And so we'll see how that plays out. And of course, here in British Columbia, we're trying to kickstart our economy after this major recession, and we cottoned onto the idea of, let's have Expo 86. And of course, that's the 100-year celebration of Vancouver. Now, expos. Expos mainly take place on a 4-year cycle. So there was a World's Fair in New Orleans in 1984. The 4-year period after that was Brisbane in 1988. So here's Expo 86. Sits right in the middle. So here are the rules. The rules is that any nation can have an expo, right, a World's Fair, on an off year, but it must have a theme. In other words, it must be a theme expo or a theme World's Fair. And of course, you all know what the theme was for Expo 86, which was transportation. And so this is where essentially False Creek goes through the transition it did. As so many of the venues, of course, were down there in the False Creek area. But some of, of course, the major infrastructure projects, this is how we got SkyTrain, this is how we got the Coquihalla, and so these are the lasting legacies, and as important, of course, is that not only do they use resources, but of course, this is how you get people back employed. And so those were the strategies of that time. But First Nations, as I mentioned, in British Columbia are really continuing their struggle because they don't have a provincial government that recognizes what Trudeau recognized back in '73. And so they continue to protest. They continue as the new Constitutional Act of 1980 comes in, that Section 35 recognizes Aboriginal title, but said that, that had to be negotiated. And then First Nations started taking their issues to the courts, and that's what injunctions are all about. Injunctions mean stop work. And so the first one happens on Mears Island, and if you go to Tofino on Vancouver Island and look north, you're looking at Mears Island. It used to be a tree farm license for Mill and Bodell, and it was very confrontational, and that you had the environmental groups and First Nations. That was the war in the woods there, and so they took it to the Supreme Court, and they awarded an injunction. They told McMillan Liddell, stop until this is straightened out. And then the next year it moved to the Stein Valley, which is across from Boston Bar in the Fraser Valley, and then Haida Gwaii on South Moresby. And so things are beginning to happen in the courts about, like, you guys in the provincial government, you can't ignore this anymore. Look at that, 1984, 1990, 40 blockades of the railways and roads, and that really disrupts the economy, and so the provincial government has to do things about that. And one of the things that happened was a change in government. The NDP got elected back in 1991. And one of their platforms was to recognize Indigenous title and, in fact, establish modern-day treaties. So it finally happened in British Columbia, and out of that we got the Nisga'a Treaty, which is up in the northwest, the Nass River Valley, from the mouth to the south of the Nass River. We get the Nisga'a Treaty, and that's well worth looking at when you get into the next section of the textbook. The other significant change that happened was the 1997 Dogmuk decision, which went through an appeal, but a final decision, which basically said that First Nations have Indigenous title to unceded lands. In other words, the provincial government can't just allow forestry or mining to happen without consultation and perhaps compensation to the land of those First Nations it belongs to. So this is kind of a summary of this module here. We've got a lot of conflict we've seen, and by the end of the century, that we have some new interesting industries, and agriculture is actually going to get a boost, because now you've got tied to the wine industry in the Okanagan and the Fraser Valley and even on Vancouver Island, and so all these wineries are directly related to tourism and directly related to agriculture, and they were directly related to the free trade agreements of the 1990s that basically said that BC better start producing good wines because the ones from California are going to come in. And so they did, and it's quite a success story. On the other hand, we get some confrontations that happen. One of the strategies that came out of that recession of the 1980s we saw earlier was to allow fish farms, and fish farms happened starting in the mid-80s, and it's really what they call net pen production of salmon, and it was mostly salmon, though some oysters were produced as well. And of course, it wasn't long before we started seeing conflicts between these fish farms which are out there in the ocean and wild salmon, and the threat of diseases and all kinds of things that started to take place. And so there's a conflict, and there's again another whole area of resource management. The forest industry is also in trouble by the end of that century. That we're involved with the U.S. in terms of softwood lumber agreements, but they're mostly disagreements. And while we appeal to the World Trade Organization, and they often find in our side, the Americans appeal that, and so nothing happens for years until they finally get an agreement. But agreements only last for 5 years, and then we're going to start over again. Meanwhile, the Gold River pulp mill is gone. The one in Prince Rupert is gone, and so we're starting to see a downturn. And another sad story is that the mountain pine beetle epidemic is getting outrageous. You can see all the red that is there in the interior of the province. These are trees that are dying, And this is the lifeblood of the forest industry in the interior. And so that again has to come into check. And you can see just the graph of production that the coast is really in serious trouble, and certainly the interior is beginning to fade. And what we'll see in our fourth and final module is where all this leads to in terms of resources, our economy, where we're going, and we'll get into that fourth module here next.